My mornings always started the same way. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the comforting sound of the house waking up with me. That day was no different, or so I thought. I tied my hair into a loose ponytail, pulled on an old t-shirt and a pair of yoga pants, and headed downstairs to tackle the chores. Life in America had a rhythm. My husband, Robert, liked his routines: breakfast at 7, out the door by 8, home by 6. We'd been married for 3 years, and by now, I'd grown used to the small quirks of our blended family. His son from his first marriage, Andrew, had recently moved back in with us. At 22, he was trying to figure things out, like most kids his age. College wasn't working for him, so he'd taken a break and was looking for a job while living under our roof. I didn't mind having him around, though. He was polite, helpful even. Every now and then, he'd offer to take out the trash or unload the dishwasher without being asked. But he was quiet, too, and we didn't talk much beyond polite small talk. That morning, Andrew was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through his phone. I smiled at him as I passed by with a basket of laundry. "Morning," I said. "Morning," he replied, barely glancing up. I started tidying up the kitchen, humming softly to myself as I wiped the counters and put away the dishes from last night. The sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, highlighting the fine layer of dust on the sill. I made a mental note to clean it later. As I bent down to pick up a stray spoon that had fallen under the counter, I felt someone's eyes on me. Straightening up, I turned to see Andrew watching me, his phone forgotten in his hand. It wasn't a casual glance, either; it lingered just a second too long. "Something wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He blinked, like he'd been caught off guard. "No, nothing. Just thinking." I nodded, brushing it off. He was probably lost in his own world, like most young men his age. Still, there was something in his expression that made me pause, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. By the time Robert came downstairs, Andrew was back on his phone, and I had moved on to mopping the floors. The moment passed, slipping away as quickly as it had come, and I didn't give it much more thought. It was just another ordinary day, or so I told myself. A few days after that fleeting moment in the kitchen, I started noticing things. Small things. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But Andrew had a way of being around at just the right time, too often to be a coincidence. Like that morning when I was wiping down the kitchen counters again, lost in my usual routine. I could feel his presence before I even turned around. He was sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, scrolling on his phone as always, but his eyes would flick up to me every few seconds. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe he was bored. Maybe I was just overly sensitive. Still, I caught myself straightening my back, adjusting my shirt, suddenly conscious of how I looked. Why did it matter? He was just a kid. Well, not a kid exactly, but he'd always seemed so much younger than his age. Quiet. Shy. Definitely not the kind of guy to make someone like me feel self-conscious. But there I was, feeling it anyway. "Need any help?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I turned to him, surprised. "With cleaning?" "No, it's fine. I've got it." "You sure?" He smiled, a boyish, almost hesitant smile. "I don't mind." "It's okay, really." "But thanks," I said, brushing a strand of hair out of my face. He shrugged and went back to his phone, but his smile lingered in my mind longer than it should have. It wasn't like I wasn't used to being around men. After all, I'd been married to Robert for 3 years. But there was something different about the way Andrew looked at me. Not like a stepson. Not like family. I pushed the thought aside and busied myself with wiping down the cabinets. The rhythmic motion of cleaning usually helped clear my mind, but this time, it didn't. Instead, I felt his gaze again, not heavy or intrusive, but there. Constant. "You're really good at this," he said, his voice casual but oddly sincere. "Good at what?" I asked without looking at him. "Taking care of everything. The house, Dad, me." I turned to face him, caught off guard by his words. "That's what family does," I said, keeping my tone light. He nodded, but there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Admiration? Gratitude? Something else? Whatever it was, it left me feeling uneasy, like I was walking a tightrope I hadn't realized I was on. It was a quiet afternoon when Andrew caught me off guard. I was sitting in the living room, folding a fresh batch of laundry while a soft playlist hummed from the speakers. Robert was still at work, and the house felt peaceful, the kind of calm that comes with knowing everything is in its place. Or so I thought. Andrew walked in, carrying a mug of tea. "You want some?" he asked, nodding toward his cup. "No, thanks," I replied with a smile. "I'm good." He hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the armchair across from me. It was unusual for him to join me like this. Usually, he kept to his room or the kitchen when Robert wasn't around. For a few minutes, we sat in silence. I focused on folding the towels, aware of his presence, but unsure of what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked. I looked up, confused. "Tired of what?" "This." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Taking care of everything. Dad. The house. Us." His question surprised me. "It's just part of life," I said after a moment. "We all have things we're responsible for." "Yeah, but doesn't it get overwhelming?" He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You do so much, and I don't think anyone really notices." I laughed softly, trying to brush off the weight of his words. "That's sweet of you to say, but I'm fine." "Really?" He shook his head. "I don't think you are." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. His eyes were serious and intense in a way that didn't match the light-hearted conversations we usually had. "Andrew," I started, keeping my voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I promise you, I'm okay." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I just think you deserve more. That's all." The words hung in the air between us, their meaning unclear but undeniably significant. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? "Thank you? Please stop?" Instead, I folded the last towel and stood up. "Well, thank you for the tea offer," I said, forcing a smile. "I should probably get dinner started." He nodded, his eyes following me as I walked out of the room. As I stepped into the kitchen, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Something about that conversation felt like crossing a line, even if I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It was just a kid trying to figure out how to connect. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. The tension in the house felt different after that conversation. Andrew didn't say anything outright, but there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me notice. He started finding excuses to be around me more often. Little things, walking into the kitchen while I was cooking, sitting in the living room longer than usual when I was folding laundry, asking questions about things he'd never cared about before. It was the middle of the afternoon when it happened. I was upstairs in my bedroom, reorganizing the closet. I'd just pulled out a box of old scarves when I heard a knock at the door. "Come in," I called, not thinking much of it. Andrew stepped in, his face unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, standing in the doorway as though unsure if he should stay. "Hey," he said finally. "Need any help?" I glanced at the pile of scarves and boxes around me. "Not really, but thanks." He didn't leave. Instead, he walked in and sat on the edge of the bed. I turned back to the closet, pretending not to notice, but my pulse quickened. "What's up?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light. "I just wanted to say." He paused, and when I turned to look at him, his expression was serious. "I really admire you." I laughed softly, hoping to diffuse the moment. "Admire me? For what?" "For everything," he said, his voice low. "The way you handle things. The way you carry yourself." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "That's nice of you to say," I managed, turning back to the closet to avoid his gaze. "But you don't have to butter me up, you know." "I'm not," he said, standing up. I mean it. The air in the room shifted. I could feel him standing behind me, closer than he needed to be. My heart raced, and I suddenly felt trapped in the small space. Andrew, I said, keeping my voice steady, this isn't appropriate. I know, he said softly. But I can't help it. I turned to face him, forcing myself to look him in the eyes. You need to stop. He nodded, but there was something in his expression, something unspoken that lingered between us. Without another word, he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. I stood there for a long moment, my hands shaking. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The house felt different after that day, quieter, heavier. Andrew avoided me for the next few days, barely saying a word at dinner, keeping his distance. At first, I felt relieved. I thought maybe the awkward moment in my bedroom had scared him into backing off, and we could both move on like nothing had happened. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Robert didn't notice anything, of course. He came home at the usual time, asked the usual questions about my day, and barely glanced at Andrew, who mumbled quick answers before disappearing back to his room. I wanted to tell Robert, but what could I say? That his son was being strange? That he'd crossed a line I couldn't quite describe? It would sound ridiculous, like I was overreacting to something harmless. One evening, I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Andrew. Need help? He asked, his voice cautious. I shook my head. I've got it, thanks. He lingered, standing too close. I focused on the knife in my hand, slicing the carrots into even pieces, pretending not to notice him watching me. Look, he said after a moment, about the other day. I stopped chopping, my hand gripping the counter. Let's not, I said firmly, turning to face him. It was a mistake. Let's move on. I know it was wrong, he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. I don't know why I said those things. I'm sorry. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think it was over, that he'd realized how inappropriate it was, and we could go back to normal. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unresolved, that made my stomach twist. It's fine, I said, forcing a smile. We'll forget it happened. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. As he turned to leave, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, only for it to be replaced by an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the awkwardness of the situation, that things would settle down with time. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Robert, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the look on Andrew's face. There was something there, something that told me this wasn't the end. The tension in the house was unbearable. Andrew's apologies had done little to ease the unease between us, and every interaction felt like walking a tightrope. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when I couldn't see him. It wasn't overt, just a glance here, a lingering presence there, but it was enough to keep me on edge. One afternoon, Robert called to say he'd be working late. The news made my stomach sink, the idea of being alone in the house with Andrew made my skin crawl. Still, I tried to focus on the chores, keeping myself busy to avoid thinking too much. I was in the laundry room, folding towels, when I heard the door creak open behind me. My heart raced, but I kept my eyes on the task in front of me, hoping he would just pass by. Hey, Andrew said, his voice soft. Hey, I replied without turning around, keeping my tone neutral. What's up? He stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps making my pulse quicken. I feel like things are weird between us. I don't want it to be like this. I straightened up, clutching the towel in my hands like a lifeline. Andrew, I think it's best if we keep some space between us. For both of us. Why? He asked, his voice quiet but insistent. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I care about you. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. This isn't okay. You know that, right? He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. I know. But I can't help how I feel. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Andrew, you're young. This is just a phase. you'll move past it. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, sadness, longing, maybe both. What if I don't want to move past it? The air felt too thick to breathe. I stepped back, putting the counter between us. You have to, I said firmly. This isn't right, and it's not fair to anyone, especially your dad. He flinched at the mention of Robert, as though the reality of the situation had finally hit him. For a moment, he just stood there, his expression a mix of frustration and defeat. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. I sank into the nearest chair, my hands trembling. I knew I'd made the right choice, but the weight of it still pressed down on me. The line had been drawn, clear and final, but I couldn't help wondering if things would ever feel normal again. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to exhale. Robert was beside me, blissfully unaware of the storm that had been brewing. I glanced at him, his steady breathing a reminder of the life we'd built together, a life I wasn't willing to jeopardize. I closed my eyes, willing the guilt and unease to fade. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. Now, all I could do was hope it would be enough to put everything behind us.